Hello, my name's Daniel King and I'm back in Hamburg for my 12th Power Play DVD. The subject this time is going to be the Hedgehog, a benign and harmless creature, you might think. Not so. Just take a look at this game. Let's plunge straight in and look at some chess. This is a game between Lev Pologievsky and Lubomir Fatachnik from Lucerne in 1982. And I think it's a perfect example of how the hedgehog can spring to life and destroy the opposition. Now, black is playing the hedgehog setup, the hedgehog system, because it's really a system rather than an opening variation. And it's a setup and a system that you can use in many different openings, as we'll see a little later. So what denotes the hedgehog? Well, it's these pawns across the third rank that control all these squares. And that means that it's very difficult for white's pieces to find an entry, to find a route through into black's position. And the reason, of course, that it's called the hedgehog is that white can get a nasty prick with one of those pawns if he comes too close. But I think it's too negative a way of looking at this setup. In fact, there's so much energy behind this row of pawns, and if that energy is released, then white can really suffer. So let's take a look at what happened in this game. It looks like black's pieces aren't really doing much on the second rank behind these pawns. Actually, look what happens here. Black crashed through with d5. Now, as we'll see a little later, this is a really typical hedgehog break, and it's a bit like splitting the atom. One tiny pawn move releases all this extraordinary pent-up energy into white's position, as we'll see now. So naturally, white takes this pawn. I mean, there are many variations here. It's a fantastically complicated position. But let's see what happened in the game. White plays the most straightforward move, taking the pawn. And now, pawn to h4. This really sets the board burning, because, of course, this pawn here is undermining this f-pawn. And white takes this. Black captures, and now the first black piece crosses the fourth rank. The queen crashes through into white's position, and suddenly you'll see that behind these extended pawns there is a huge amount of space. It's like a vacuum that's going to suck black's pieces towards white's king. First of all, we'll note this open diagonal and this open diagonal as well. Now white captures a pawn and black recaptures. And you can see it's not just this queen that's going to come into play, not just this bishop, but this bishop too is looking good. And these rooks also are now beautifully placed on central files. Now, white didn't find the best defense here, but already he's in some trouble. I've given some variations here. If you'd like to go back and look at those, they're fascinating. It's a brilliant game. But let's rattle on with this game. I just want to give you the general concept, the general idea of what this hedgehog break is all about. e5, not a good move. It opens up the line for this bishop, and as we'll see, that allows black a deadly mating attack. So first of all, a check, and now a rather brilliant move, knight h5. Of course, threatening a massive check on g3, so white was forced to take this, and now queen g3. The idea is, of course, mate is threatened with queen takes bishop on g2, supported by the bishop on b7, but there's another checkmate, queen here. The idea of deflecting the queen is that this bishop is no longer protected by the queen, and two mates is too much for white to defend against. White tried this, but after rook takes, a very clever move indeed, instead of bishop takes, then white is completely lost. And the game ended, well, you can see if rook takes, I'm afraid this doesn't help white at all. Those mates are still threatened with the queen. So instead of that, white played rook f1, and now a brilliant finish. Queen takes g2. And it all happens with checks here. After rook d2 check, white actually resigned. And, well, it's forced mate. That's why. Let's go the whole way. Well, it's extraordinary that if we just go back here, after d5, a mere 10 moves later, white resigned, his king in a dreadful mating net, and it's hard to imagine that coming from this position where black's pieces are actually behind this row of pawns, apart from this brave pawn that has crossed the 3rd rank and actually comes to the 5th rank. But this is such a typical hedgehog attack. It's so common that black breaks out from behind these pawns and launches a really violent attack. This is modern chess. The hedgehog setup was developed in the 1960s and early 1970s by players such as Fischer, Karpov, Andersson, and many Eastern Europeans such as Fatachnik and Schuber, among others. And Kasparov also has played the hedgehog to with great success. This really is modern chess. You know, I can't imagine players from the Capablanca era, for example, playing like this. And the great thing is you can play this setup from so many different openings. So it's really good to have an understanding of the hedgehog, because it allows you you can employ it in so many different situations. But also I think it's very good to have an understanding of this with the white pieces if you're playing with the white as well, because it's good to know the dangers, but also there are many positives about having this so-called Marozzi bind position where you have pawns on c4 and e4. Perhaps we should have a closer definition of what the hedgehog is exactly. And let's look at the pawn structures and we'll get a better idea, a clearer idea of what the hedgehog is. Here we go. This is quite a typical position where white has pawns on e4 and c4, and this d pawn has been exchanged for black's c pawn. So you can see that there's a semi-open file here against the pawn on d6, and black has a semi-open c file. So this is really the hedgehog situation, where black has brought a pawn, usually c5, and exchanged it for a pawn on d4. Let's make that a bit clearer. There we are. So this is a typical hedgehog position, and you'll see the pawns along the 3rd rank here. Sometimes this pawn is on a7, sometimes this on b7. Sometimes these pawns differently placed, perhaps on g6 or perhaps on h6. But the important thing is these two pawns here and the fact that black has exchanged a c pawn for a d pawn. Now here we have white had a fianchettoed bishop, but it doesn't have to be fianchettoed. I repeat, the important thing is semi-open c file, semi-open d file. So here's another example of a hedgehog position. So here there's no fianchetto from white, but he has this pawn chain. And again, of course, the c pawn here, c4, and black has the typical hedgehog position. But the important thing is that black has exchanged off the c pawn for the d pawn, semi-open c file, semi-open d file. That denotes the hedgehog setup. Okay, let's look at another typical hedgehog position. Okay, once again, the important thing is black has exchanged off the c pawn for white's d pawn. Here, slightly different position because white hasn't constructed the so-called Marozzi bind, but has just a fianchettoed bishop instead. And of course, this changes the nature of the positions radically, or let's say slightly. Now, you'll notice that these pawn structures are very similar to the Sicilian pawn structure, where black also exchanges off a c pawn for a d pawn. The difference is, in the Sicilian, that this c pawn stays on c2. And I don't particularly want to discuss these kind of positions, so I'm going to be discussing positions where the c pawn is on c4. Of course, in many variations of the Sicilian, white also plays the pawn to c4 in Marozzi bind type positions, and indeed many of the hedgehog positions we'll be looking at on this DVD arise from the Sicilian defence. But I just want to be clear, I'm not going to be examining positions where there is a white pawn on c2. So the next question is, after that, in what openings, out of which openings can the hedgehog position arise? Well, when I was looking through these, researching for this DVD, there's one player who I immediately turned to when I thought of the hedgehog, and that's Ulf Andersson, Swedish Grandmaster, one of the pioneers of the hedgehog in the early 70s. So I decided to look at his games, and it's incredible. He has made a whole career out of playing the hedgehog, and he plays it almost in any opening, not just with black, but sometimes with white as well. Let's have a look at some of his games, and this gives you an idea of the versatility of the hedgehog. That's one of its great strengths, its flexibility. So here, Andersson's opponent played e4, and it looks like a normal Sicilian position. It is indeed a normal Sicilian position, and here knight f6 would be the normal move, and so on. And dragon, Scheveningen, Najdorf, classical, whatever. But instead of knight f6, Andersson played a6, a tricky little move. Now, of course, this invites white to play pawn to c4, as the knight hasn't come to c3 yet, which Andersson's opponent did. A typical Marozzi bind. Marozzi bind and hedgehog, they're very closely related. This I refer to as the Marozzi bind, these two pawns here, but it's whether black plays the pawn to e6 or g6 or, which combination. But basically this is a kind of hedgehog position. Naturally, white doesn't have to play c4. White can play knight c3 or, move a bishop out. But, many people simply go c4. And here we see Andersson employing the typical hedgehog setup. It's not exactly an accelerated dragon. Normally black plays with knight c6 in that case and often exchanges off on d4. But in the hedgehog, normally you play the knight to d7, as we'll see. There we go, the knight comes to d7. As we'll see, this is really a very important part of the setup, that these knights protect each other, but also it keeps open the c-file. That's going to be the source of counterplay for black in many positions. And now black would like to play b6 followed by bishop b7, and that reaches sort of the perfect classical hedgehog position. But at the moment, b6 would run into knight c6, and a move like knight d5 would be rather unpleasant. So first of all, well, you could play knight d5 there. Of course, you can play knight takes pawn check. That'd be quite good. Let's go back. So anyway, before playing b6, rook e8 has to be played. Looks like a very strange move, but actually this move is very often a part of the hedgehog setup anyway. And now it's possible to play b6 because the e7 pawn is protected. Knight c6, queen c7 gets nowhere at all. And there we go. Andersson has arrived at his hedgehog setup with these knights protecting each other and the bishops, like here, fianchettoed. Sometimes you put the bishop on e7, sometimes it goes to g7. But if we just see a few moves later on, yeah, this is the hedgehog setup. And do we need to worry about this pawn? Well, a little bit sometimes, but here Andersson just protected it with bishop to f8. So that's one way of getting into a hedgehog setup. Okay, let me give you another way. This is also a Sicilian defense. I'm giving you, every single game here is by Andersson. I'm just giving you an example of the how he uses this setup. Now this time he played e6, and this is a more normal way, a more usual way of getting into a hedgehog via the Sicilian. And now a6, the can system. And here, of course, white can play knight c3 and bishop d3, other moves, but very often white accepts the invitation to go for this Marozzi bind, and here Andersson gets the hedgehog setup that he wants, and so on. Okay, he plays with g6, but sometimes you can just simply play with bishop b7 as well. Okay, so that's with e6. That's another way of getting into the hedgehog. And this is very common. This is a beautiful game that Andersson played against Karpov. Again with e6, and this time he plays knight c6, which can lead to different systems for Scheveningen, for example. Karpov plays knight b5, which more or less forces d6, and that allows him to play this Marozzi bind. And there we go, bishop e7, and we get this typical hedgehog position. Okay, another opening. Okay, we've swapped over to the Reti, the English, and this is a very typical way of getting a hedgehog. And after g3, black wants to oppose this bishop and plays b6. If you're going to play the hedgehog, then it's important to play b6 and bishop b7 straight away. Otherwise, sometimes it can be difficult to get in b6 later on, when this bishop is zipping down the diagonal. So here we go, and white plays d4, pawns are exchanged, and we have this typical hedgehog setup. And there are lots of different ways of playing this with black. d6, for example, is the classic way, but sometimes players like to play with knight c6 as well. Okay, the piece is in slightly different positions here, but I think concentrate on the pawn structure. That doesn't vary very much. So it's when the c pawn is exchanged for the d pawn and there's a white pawn on c4. That denotes the hedgehog. And Andersson's bishop came back, and here they agreed to draw with the full fight still ahead, but after d6 you can see we have a typical hedgehog setup. Okay, another opening. This is, another classic hedgehog. White could of course play d4 here and get a Queen's Indian, but he waited, and now we have a hedgehog again. And this time Andersson plays it in a more classic way with d6, and a6, and knight d7, and so on. You can see it's a very typical setup. Okay. And this time we have a Queen's Indian. So not the Reti, but Andersson still manages to get a kind of hedgehog position. Okay, this is one of the main lines, the old main line of the Queen's Indian. c5, of course you can play bishop e4 and f5. But this leads to rather a typical hedgehog position. C pawn is exchanged for the d pawn, and so on. Rook a7. Looks a bit strange to put the rook here, but as we'll see, black can get away with a great deal in the hedgehog, and in fact it's not that bad at all, and he very quickly unravelled. I know it looks like, at the moment, it looks like rather a passive system, but as we'll see, there's so much energy contained behind these pawns on the third rank. When you break out, it can have a massive effect on the game and really blow white's position apart. Okay, let's go quickly on. So we've seen you can get the hedgehog from the Sicilian in various ways, the Reti in the English, the Queen's Indian, and here's another variation of the Queen's Indian, where somehow Andersson engineers a hedgehog position that he loves so much. First a check, that's to put the knight on not such an active square, and the bishop comes back, and the c-pawn comes up. Of course, white could exchange on c5, but, well, we've seen in earlier power play DVDs that this structure can be rather attractive, rather pleasant for black, because you have an extra centre pawn here, gives you good control of the centre, and then you can play down the b file using your a pawn to try and weaken a pawn down here. So white castled. Now came e4, black took, and we have a hedgehog position. Everything's normal. It's great. Sometimes when you get the hedgehog, you can play your first 10 moves just with your eyes closed. It's really nice, and then you get a very comfortable, familiar position. Okay, so that was two different variations of the Queen's Indian, where you can get a hedgehog. This time, Andersson gets the hedgehog from the Bogo Indian. b6. You can see that all these systems are related. Up, the c-pawn comes up, we know what's going to happen. There we go, we've got the pawn structure, and there we are. You see, whatever opening he plays, he manages to bring it round to a hedgehog. Okay, next one. This hedgehog arises from the Nimzo Indian. Queen c2, very fashionable variation, and of course there are lots of moves here. d5, castles are typical. But of course you can play c5, which is the old main line. And white takes. And black is going to recapture that pawn. And we have a kind of hedgehog. Okay, this one's a little bit different because the bishop here on b4 is, well, outside the pawn chain, not on e7. Changes the position a little bit. But white doesn't have the great Marozzi bind. But still, it's a hedgehog position that black is playing. So, that was a Nimzo, and this is really strange. It's a King's Indian, a Samish variation King's Indian, and you must be thinking, well, it's impossible for Andersson to get a hedgehog position out of this. Just watch. Of course, if white plays d5 here, you're not going to get a hedgehog. However, he just played knight e2. And even from a King's Indian, Andersson has managed to achieve his hedgehog setup. Looks rather strange playing bishop f8. He wanted to protect the d-pawn so that he could play e6. But finally he gets his hedgehog position. So there we go. That just shows the range of openings you can get the hedgehog from, and I think shows why it's such a valuable system to understand, because you really can apply it in so many different situations. Okay, before we get into detail, of course, I'm going to show you some test positions. As ever, it would be very helpful if you had a proper chess set at your side to analyse properly. I find it's impossible to analyse from the screen. So do have a chess set. Do close the notation window as well, so you're not getting any hints from anyone, and please, no Fritz at all. And I'll be setting you questions all the way through this DVD to keep you on your toes. So we'll take a break there and see you with the test positions any second.